Welcome back to what is sadly our last panel discussion session for the day, and I really hope you've enjoyed the discussion today as much as I have. And so the focus of the panel today is on the theme of All Together Now, Mobilising Whole of Society Responses to International Protection. And we've already discussed in the discussions today the immense pressures that the sort of traditional state-led protection mechanisms are under. And what we want to do with this panel is to reflect on how multi-stakeholder collaborations involving civil society actors, refugee-led organizations, subnational governments, and other actors can come together to try and support, not replace the state-led mechanism, which clearly must be essential, but to come together to try and support them to increase the space for protection. And I'm thrilled to be able to unpack these topics with such an incredible panel. Starting from the opposite end, we have Hafsar Tameesuddin, who is the Co-Secretary General of the Asia-Pacific Rights Network, a coalition of more than 270 organizations and individuals across 28 countries who are working to advance the rights of refugees and others in need of protection across the Asia-Pacific region. A Rohingya activist, social worker, and human rights defender, Hafsar brings a perspective of both leadership and first-hand experience of displacement to their advocacy on a wide range of issues, including refugee rights, statelessness, LGBTQI+ inclusion, gender equality, and the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence. Next, James Jegasothy is Deputy CEO of Multicultural New South Wales, advising state government on policies and programs to achieve the full potential of multiculturalism. Having come to Australia as a refugee, James is passionate about achieving equitable outcomes for people and communities. He has over 2 decades of experience working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities and has held senior leadership and governance roles in government, for-purpose, and community organisations. Welcome, James. And sitting next to me, we have Professor Kate Ogg, who is an Australian Research Council Fellow and Professor at ANU Law School, specialising in international refugee and human rights law. She's the author of Protection from Refuge, From Refugee Rights to Migration Management, and is currently working on 2 ARC projects which are very closely related to our discussions today. One exploring refugee community sponsorship, and a second on the evolution of strategic human rights litigation in Australia. And joining us live from the UK, we have Dr. Jeff Crisp, who's a visiting research fellow at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford and is one of the world's foremost analysts of refugee, migration and humanitarian issues, having served in multiple senior policy roles with UNHCR, Refugees International and the Global Commission on International Migration. And we're so grateful for all of you for making the time to be here today, but a special thank you to you, Jeff, for joining so very early in the morning in the UK.
Thank you.
So I'd like us, I think our focus is going to be on building partnerships, but I thought it'd be worth taking a step back initially just to sort of paint a picture of how some of the challenges we've been discussing today are playing out on the ground. And to that end, Hafsar, I wanted to start with you, please. And I'm just keen to get your perspectives on what the recent cuts to US aid and also funding for the UNHCR budget have meant for the communities that you've been working with, and how refugee-led organisations and the local communities have responded.
Thank you. Well, it's always bad, and it's becoming worse. In Asia and Pacific region, not many countries have refugee policies, so it's always have been bad in terms of non-refoulement, detention, registration, and all of that. But then, after the funding cut, I'm sure you all have been following the news that many INGOs and NGOs that has been providing the practical programs and support to the refugees for their day-to-day survival is becoming really challenging. Of course, also the other thing is that, well, from our observation, particularly in Asia and Pacific region, refugee issue has always been seen through the security lens. It is not usually seen through the humanitarian lens. And then when there is things like this happen, it's become more look. And it's also amazed me how this many countries like in Asia and Pacific region thinks that the only solution for refugees is like send them all to another resettled country. And then when US say, oh, we're not gonna resettle refugees, then instead of thinking about how do we step up to fill in the gap, they become so paranoid and freaking out. Now, how do we get rid of the refugee from our land? They're gonna be here, they're not gonna go anywhere. And then that is the reason why we have been constantly seeing a lot of this non-refoulement and forced repatriation of Afghan refugees from many different parts of Asia and Pacific region, as well as from other parts of the world. And detention and non-refoulement, that happened from India a lot, in the past, now even happening more. And then the immigration rates of refugees is becoming even worse. And then because the funding is becoming very limited for UNHCR, for them to do more work on monitoring the situation of detention of refugees and the mistreatment and then human rights violation in the detention becoming very limited. They can't do that. And then the worst part is now, these countries in Asia and Pacific region, the political situations are not getting better, which means people are always compelled to, forced to leave. Not because they want to, of course. And then there is always a new arrival of people to Bangladesh, to Indonesia, to all these neighboring countries, and then UNHCR obviously cannot do the registration because they don't have this, human resource and all that. And the worst part is that I will tell you one story. I'm very sure you have heard so much, 1,000 of similar stories like this. There has been one Afghan refugee woman has been waiting for resettlement for 12 years or plus something, a single mother with so many kids. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to get resettled Hafsar very soon. And then when this thing happened, she was messaging me, like, I want to die. I have no hope. I don't know what to do, and there is no job. It's like destroying the hope to live for the many, many thousands of refugees. And the challenges of surviving in their day-to-day reality comes with the mental health challenges. So we know that even in countries like Australia and New Zealand, mental health funding is very limited, it's not. For the refugee protection, there is only a small amount of funding and going to all different pockets. Who want to talk about this mental health? And we used to have small number of organizations that focus on mental health in refugee hosting country. Now the funding can't happen. No mental health organization. Now the stress that refugee communities are experiencing, escalating trauma and all that, plus the SGBB responding organization are completely shut down because there is no money. And then all this protection stress is elevating and even becoming worse in this women and girls and other vulnerable groups being exposed to sexual gender-based violence. There was no entity to intervene. And then in those refugee hosting countries, you can't go to the police because you don't exist. So there are so many things. But then what is happening in these kind of challenging times is that I am constantly amazed and aware of the resilience and the passion that the affected community themselves carry through. One example is that in Bangladesh, UNICEF has closed all of that education, is done nothing. And then these smaller RLOs and RLIs, they just come together and then with the whatever tools that they have, a little bit of knowledge that they're doing this community-led, refugee-led learning center, where they're still delivering this education. And then in Malaysia, Linda is sitting there, we have trained about 10 women-led refugee-led organizations. They are well equipped with the knowledge how to respond to the STBB, secure gender-based violence. They're doing it ad hoc, stepping in, holding up the space. Also in Indonesia and Thai, Myanmar border and all of that, refugee-led learning center. They are driven by the refugees without proper resources, with a very limited funding. They're holding up the space. But then the bigger question is, when things like this happen, the moral authority of people with lived experience is always questioned in terms of how do we do the localization? And that localization also comes with the challenge that, okay, if we localize all this funding, where do we go? So there are a lot of good examples happening in the region, but we still also have a lot of challenges that is resisting this localization idea with the fear of, in my entire life, being in the refugee space, being the savior and the protector has been my identity so close to me. If you do another localization, where do I go? Where does my identity fit? And also many other bureaucracy and all these things. So yeah, we're still there, pushing and pulling.
Thanks so much, Hafsar. And we'll come back to me unpacking some of those themes in the course of today about how we, identifying what those challenges are and how we can find ways to overcome them. But I'd like to hand over to you, Jeff, now. And we're going from the local impacts now up to reflecting on the impacts that the budget cuts and the current global politics have had on UNHCR. And your reflections on those impacts, and also how you see the role of that organisation evolving in the next few years.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel, and greetings to everybody from Oxford in the UK. I'm getting a terrible amount of echo, I'm afraid. That's better. Okay, so in terms of the evolution and the future direction of UNHCR, I think it's very difficult to predict with any degree of precision or accuracy. But I'm sure, as your preceding discussion has already made clear, business as usual is not an option at the moment. So what are the likely trends that we are going to see? Firstly, I think UNHCR is inevitably going to become a smaller organisation, smaller in terms of its budget, its staffing, and in terms of its geographical presence. I think there's going to be particular pressure on UNHCR to withdraw from parts of the world which are relatively prosperous and where refugee needs are met largely by the state and by the voluntary sector. So in that respect, I would expect to see a reduction of UNHCR's presence in Europe, for example. I'm not quite sure what the implications will be specifically for Australia. I also expect to see a withdrawal of UNHCR from parts of the world where the number of refugees is relatively small. I was talking yesterday to somebody from Trinidad, for example, and she told me that UNHCR is in the process of withdrawing completely from the Caribbean region, where, of course, the number of refugees is relatively modest compared to other parts of the world. So certainly, I think we're going to see a smaller UNHCR in the future. Secondly, I think we're going to see pressure on UNHCR because of the budgetary pressures and because of the political pressures to withdraw from activities and policy areas that are not directly related to its core mandate of refugee protection and solutions. So in that respect, I would expect to see a reduced UNHCR involvement in activities such as reintegration and reconstruction in situations when refugees have gone back to their country of origin. At the moment, UNHCR is still involved in some quite large-scale development projects in countries of origin, which it could be argued belong more naturally to development agencies. So I would expect to see UNHCR doing less of that reintegration and reconstruction work in post-repatriation situations. I also expect to see pressures on UNHCR to reduce its role in natural disasters and climate change, and quite possibly also pressures on UNHCR to reduce its involvement with internally displaced populations. A third trend, which I think we're almost certain to see in the months and years to come, is that donor states particularly will be seeking to transform UNHCR from a refugee protection organisation to a migration management agency. And I think that process is already underway. We've seen it, for example, with UNHCR's endorsement of the whole notion of return hubs in Europe, its kind of qualified endorsement of offshore processing, and its kind of enthusiasm at the moment for what are called whole of route approaches. And I think these all tend to suggest that UNHCR is moving away from refugee protection and towards migration management. In broader terms, a trend that I've detected is that the whole question of territorial asylum is being questioned. States would much rather, if they admit refugees at all, would rather do so through safe and legal and organised and planned movements of people. And I think UNHCR will be under pressure to move in that direction, moving away from territorial asylum and toward the planned and organised movement of refugees. That question of migration management brings up another important issue as far as the future of UNHCR is concerned, which is its relationship with the International Organization for Migration and the possibility of a merger between UNHCR and IOM. And as you may know, one of the possibilities that has been raised in the UN80 program of organizational reform is indeed a merger between IOM and UNHCR. My suspicion is that it probably won't ultimately happen, but at the same time, I would say that there is a need for a clarification of the respective roles and responsibilities of the two organizations. The truth is that over recent decades, both UNHCR and IOM have become all-purpose aid agencies, doing similar things in the same places and appealing for the same unlimited sources of funding. We've seen this particularly recently in Afghanistan, where both UNHCR and IOM have been competing for funds to provide assistance to Afghan earthquake victims. And as one of my former UNHCR colleagues pointed out, these people are not migrants and they're not refugees, but nevertheless, IOM and UNHCR are competing for funding to assist them. So I think a clarification of the roles of the two organizations is something that we can expect to see in the near future. In terms of the kind of support that you and we can provide to UNHCR, I think UNHCR is susceptible to external pressure. And I would suggest that we need to pressurize UNHCR in three particular ways. Firstly, to absolutely stick to the fundamental principles of refugee protection, including the right to seek asylum, the principle of non-refoulement, and the principle that return should always take place in a safe and voluntary manner. Let's encourage UNHCR to stick absolutely to those fundamental principles. I think, and coming back to the theme of this session, we should encourage UNHCR to act in a more consultative and participatory manner than has been the case in the past. In fact, way back in the mid-1990s, I wrote the UNHCR mission statement, which said that UNHCR is committed to the principles of consultation and participation of refugees. But over the last 20, 30 years, relatively little has been done in that respect. In recent times, the growing visibility and voice of refugee-led organizations has made that position untenable for UNHCR. And I think one of the key trends to watch out for in the future is the way in which UNHCR actually relates to refugee-led organizations and involves them in its programming and policy and advocacy activities. And then my final point, encouragement to UNHCR, would be really to engage in forceful public advocacy. Here in the UK, UNHCR played an absolutely brilliant role in combating the proposal for deporting all asylum seekers to Rwanda. UNHCR was absolutely central in getting that taken off the table. It demonstrates that forceful public advocacy really does have an impact. And I'd also suggest that UNHCR should be encouraged not to replace forceful public advocacy with marketing, branding, and celebrity endorsement, which I think has been a trend of the organisation in recent times. So stick to the basic principles, engage more with refugees and refugee-led organisations, and don't be seduced by social media when public advocacy is really required, would be my recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you to Hafsar as well for really laying the groundwork and painting the picture of the pressures that are happening both at the local and international level. And I'd like us to kind of move on now to the main substance of the theme, which is, how can we build partnerships and build collaborations to help address some of these pressures and fill some of these gaps. And James, if I could throw over to you now, I'd be keen to hear about your take on the role that local and state governments can play in strengthening refugee protection locally, and also promising examples of practices from your work at Multicultural New South Wales.
Thank you, Daniel. Look, as a representative of government, I'm probably going to have to be slightly more circumspect than Jeff was in my comments, but I'm also going to try and be a bit more optimistic as well. And look, when we think of government in this country, we think of the three spheres of government. We have the national government, which we really link to sort of refugee protection. We have a state government, and of course we have a local government as well. And it's important to say they all have a role in protection. Our responsibilities, our obligations under refugee protection don't end when we remove someone from the immediate danger. We have to be able to give them access to education, to health. We have to be able to give them an opportunity to live their life free from those things which they feared before. And if I make it really simple, the role of state government and local government is really about providing that social and physical infrastructure to ensure that protection is sort of fully realised. And in New South Wales, we're lucky we have some of these things enshrined in legislation. We're the first state to have multicultural principles enshrined in legislation. And I know, as Jeff was noting, like having things enshrined and being committed to them is really important. It's easy for governments from different colours to change their minds on some of these things and appreciate them in different ways and perhaps reinterpret them. But we have those principles enshrined. And part of that is, because we want to ensure there's equity in service delivery and, equal access to, the things the state provides. But it's also to send some important messages to the community as well. We often talk about, diversity as an asset. And some of those things can be a little naff in a sense, like, going to festivals and seeing all this stuff and intercultural understanding. But they're very much linked to the way people see refugees. And many people out there, the average punter doesn't see the difference when they think of people who might be different to them or people who are migrants or refugees. And all of these things are part of creating that social infrastructure and really creating a bit of social license for state governments and national governments to see, no, we can do things that are better for people who are, who've come as refugees, but also to push the point that supporting people who are refugees is also supporting everyone. It's an important outcome for our state. So that's sort of a broad thing. I won't go into it too much, but obviously, for things like state government, we have a real responsibility for getting hospitals and roads and aged care and looking at things about education already in places where we're going to settle people. That's a really sort of obvious pieces of infrastructure that are there. There's also those softer bits of infrastructure. There's things that local governments are engaged in, whether it's messaging or ensuring there are places of worship that are supported in communities, especially regional communities. Because it's important to think that if someone is fearful of practicing their religion somewhere else, then we bring them here and settle them in a place where they can't practice that religion. It's hardly protection in the end. We're just taking them away from the danger. And those are the kinds of infrastructure that state and local government, certainly put in place. And I was lucky enough to be in Griffith last weekend, and I saw some of that in a town which has, long history of multiculturalism, issues for sure, but you have a mayor there who's talking about having a just and fair place for asylum seekers. You have human rights language being used by a mayor, and we really don't often hear that in international or national discourse by political leaders. And that has a real relevance to asylum seekers and refugees living in those communities, hearing it from someone locally as well. So all those things are really important. I won't go into some of the issues, but obviously the real issues there with planning and how you work with the Commonwealth. And I do have an example. Do you want me to give you?
Please.
Well, look, the state government's role, we see our role in this as, yes, we provide services. Yes, we cover bases where the federal government has not done that. But it's also in the role of coordinating, bringing people together around these services. And I know there's a lot of people in this room who've worked on the New South Wales settlement strategy. And it's a really important piece of work. I moved here this year from Western Australia, and that's not where I came as a refugee from. That was from Sri Lanka. but we're certainly very, but even coming from another state, you look at New South Wales, and you're really proud of the work that's been done here. You're proud of the fact that you've come as a state government and made a commitment to supporting refugees and people who are like refugees. And we're hearing that in Burma, you don't have that at a national level. We don't have a strategy at a national level here. And having a state that's taken on that responsibility is a really important message, but also a really important coordinating role. And one that's involved partners, many of whom are in the room today, who've helped orchestrate it and bring lived experience and bring tools for government, holding accountability in government, letting them report and say, yes, we've provided this accessible service, yes, we've created this difference in people's lives, and we're holding ourselves publicly accountable for those things. I could go on, but I appreciate we can get back to some of
Thank you
these
so
things.
much, James. And we'll come back, particularly to the leadership role that the state government can play in a moment. Katie, do you want to jump in to respond to that point?
I just wanted to add, look, really great points, but just to add, when we think about multiculturalism and diversity in a settler colonial society, that includes our First Nations people. And I think one of the missing parts of the puzzle to get meaningful partnerships is to work with First Nations people in refugee protection. And a really good practical example of where I've seen that as part of my research in community sponsorship is in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where Maori practices of hospitality have just been embedded in their community sponsorship program right from the beginning. And my colleague, Professor Susan Kneebone from the University of Melbourne, is leading that research, and she's got an article on that coming out in the Refugee Survey Quarterly soon. And I think I'd add to that too is like speaking to sponsors in different parts of the world, probably the sponsors that I would say had the most sophisticated understanding of the displacement and the political causes of displacement were in Ireland. And that's because the Irish people, as a formerly colonised people, could really understand the way in which colonialism has created these dynamics that have, created forced displacement. And I think that there's such opportunities in Australia for us to have that greater awareness too because of our cultural history.
And Kate, sticking with community sponsorship, I mean, it's such a great example of multi-stakeholder collaboration in action. So I mean, based on your research, I appreciate your insights about what that sort of multi-stakeholder collaboration brings to refugee protection.
Yep. Thanks, that's a really good question. And picking up on Lisa Button's point earlier, yes, these programs are small. So they're resettling very small numbers of refugees. So one of the questions that I had as part of this research is, well, if they're small, do they nevertheless have greater systemic benefits for refugee protection, in particular with respect to durable solutions? So we heard earlier from Basma about the amazing benefits of community sponsorship for communities and local communities, and that's fantastic. But coming from this perspective of international refugee law, I wanted to ask the question, well, how about for national asylum systems, and also how about for the international refugee protection regime more broadly? Now, we can't be too starry-eyed about community sponsorship because there are challenges and we might get to talk about those. But are there these greater systemic benefits? Yes, there are. My research has shown that. Not always in the way that civil society have anticipated, but to give you a few examples. And interestingly, those systemic benefits are coming out of the partnerships that community sponsorship facilitates and necessitates, but also through organic, unexpected partnerships that come through community sponsorship. So I'm going to give you a few examples. In the UK, it's really been fascinating. So speaking to civil society in the UK who've been working in refugee protection for a long time, before community sponsorship, they were not networked. It was very different to the environment here. They weren't talking to each other, they were fragmented, and they were not politically powerful. It was community sponsorship that was introduced there in 2015 that actually facilitated these relationships between civil society, allowed them to talk to each other, mobilise, and they've become much more politically powerful. Plus, community sponsorship opened up relationships between civil society in the UK and government. So one interviewee told me, before community sponsorship, if we wanted to talk to government, the Home Office, about a refugee protection matter, we'd have to turn up outside the Home Office with a placard. That's the only option we have. Now we have monthly meetings with government, and we have their direct contact numbers. And they've been able to leverage those relationships to achieve refugee protection outcomes beyond community sponsorship, beyond resettlement as well. So for a few examples, it's been community sponsorship actors that have convinced the UK government not to reduce its resettlement targets post the Syrian conflict, which they had planned to do. They also convinced the UK government to adopt a specific unaccompanied minor resettlement program, which I think in that context quite appropriately was done outside community sponsorship channels. They've also had successful advocacy with respect to refugees who come outside of resettlement, which we know are the vast majority, and in particular the conditions of detention and refugees who are homeless or facing homelessness. So that's one example from the UK. Ireland's been really fascinating in the way in which community sponsorship facilitates partnerships but directly between the state and citizens. And those partnerships in Ireland have been really important in creating this really interesting state-citizen solidarity infrastructure for expressing solidarity with refugees and pushing back against far-right anti-refugee hostility. So we see lots of examples around the world of citizen solidarity with refugees. We see it all the time, but they're often against the state, protesting against state policies, or the state is absent. And in Ireland, what you see is government representatives and citizens sitting alongside each other, showing solidarity for refugees and pushing back against far-right hostility. And when I say sitting side by side, sometimes I mean quite literally sitting side by side. One of the cases that I sort of uncovered as part of the research, it was fascinating. It was a rural town in Ireland that was hosting a meeting about community sponsorship. So there were citizens there who were leading that. There were government representatives as well, because that's how community sponsorship works. And the meeting was stormed by far-right anti-asylum protesters who travelled from Dublin to specifically interrupt the meeting. They were able to be quietened and given their marching orders, so to speak, and they never came back to this community. And with interviews with people in that community, what became really apparent was that it was the fact that it was both the state representatives, it was actually the Minister of Immigration himself at that meeting, and he followed up after the incident with a ministerial statement, and local citizens from that community. The fact that they were both part of this initiative were able to counter outside far-right asylum hostility, but also suppress it within the community itself. The example I give from Australia, look, Australia has such a fascinating history of community sponsorship. It's a cyclical history in many ways. And there's been lots of examples of community sponsorship programs we've had, but we've had a lot of community-led community sponsorship programs, both historically and currently. And I think what's really interesting about those is that they exist in a symbiotic relationship with UNHCR-led resettlement. So what I mean by that, there's a bit of assumption that communities should cede power to the UNHCR to choose what refugees should be resettled, because UNHCRs are the best position to do that. I think that assumption is really being challenged now. Especially because UNHCR can't always offer all refugee communities resettlement options, sometimes because of the urgency of the situation, sometimes because of politics. And so what community-led community sponsorship, sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, in Australia has been able to do is provide access to resettlement, often for refugees who don't have access to UNHCR resettlement. So that's what I mean by acting in a symbiotic relationship. And this is the last point I'll make, and this is going to the organic partnerships that can happen through community sponsorship, is a lot of these community sponsors in Australia, they're small in number, but they are so highly knowledgeable about Australian migration law and policy. As a lawyer, I can learn a hell of a lot from them. But they have developed transnational networks with sponsors in other parts of the world. And when, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to get a person to Australia through our sponsorship infrastructure, they've been able to reach out to their networks over the world, and they've sometimes been able to get a sponsorship pathway for that refugee elsewhere, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting dynamic, and it just shows you, I guess, all the different directions that cooperation and multi-stakeholder collaboration go in, whether within states or within similar actors across states. Hafsar, if I could turn back to you now, I guess I'm interested to hear your reflections on the dynamics between grassroots, local actors, and international organizations, and how that's playing out, I guess, in the context of restricted funding, but also opportunities you see for improving cooperation across those two levels of organizations.
Yeah, it has been there since before the US funding cuts start again. So I was in Geneva in 2024, March, sitting at the donor roundtable meeting, and the donors from different member states were saying, we are committing 50 million, 70 million, 60 million to such and such refugee in different part of the world. I said, do you know how many percentage of your donation is actually going to the community, and from my very big observation is that maybe 20% or maybe less than that. And may I also propose that if you are working closely and also with the local organization and all that will cut down a lot of costs there, and then the impact that you will actually have on the ground will be very high. And then the answer from the government, those members say, Hafsar, we love to do that, but we cannot. I said, why? Because we have such and such legislation in our government saying that we have to follow such and such protocol and bureaucracy. I said, we're here to facilitate. So it has been there. And also, interestingly enough, I had a podcast that we co-produced with the new humanitarian, me and Assistant High Commissioner to UNHCR, Rauf. We talk about power shift from the top down to the bottom up approach. What does it mean? And then we talk about, okay, now we have globally increased number of refugees and forced displacement every day. It's never going smaller. It's becoming more and more. There is a lot of pressure. So if we don't look at the modality of refugees are heavily forced to depend and rely on the funding, if we don't look at the modality of from charity, humanitarian bursts to self-reliance, how are we going to survive? So it was before funding cut off, and I hope we didn't predict that, the bad news. And then we're like, okay, what's going to happen to these people if they are not allowed to work, if they have to be heavily reliant on the funding? What happens if one day suddenly the funder and donor decide, okay, no more money? Are they going to die? So it was always there, and I think there was a lot of hesitation and fear of, so what's going to happen if we do this, and a lot of barriers. And then there was this tension and dynamic of, starting from Najeeba's conversation before me, talking about decolonization of power, and then shifting the power and localization. All of that there is fear of like, I have previously said that before this question, is that people have been in those spaces and doing this, become a part of the identity. This is me being in this. And then when you talk about localization, slowly giving up, and then slowly, okay, now the communities are ready. We have to step back, take the ownership and lead it, and then there is a greater benefit of it. And that becoming a challenge. And then we now figuring out how do we coexist. And the bigger question is it really important to coexist? Is it really important to save lives? Is it really important to look at the cost versus the people? and then also I was having a chat 2 days ago talking about this one organization, INGO, that has been completely shut down for SGBB. The running cost for this INGO is maybe approximately about $700K USD per year to run the organization. So as I've mentioned, the women-led, refugee-led organization who have been trained to do the SGBB work, very well equipped with the skill, they will need only 100K, I can tell you. They can run this. Yeah. But then why are you so worried about having 700K to run an INGO and your sustainability versus there is an opportunity to do the same similar quality work, maybe even better, because it is going to be led by the community, delivered by the community, for the community. But then there was still this resistance of like, you don't want to make the bigger move, the bold move, because it's gonna then, where do we live and where is your identity crisis? And then also I wanna go back to this, the previous question you asked about, what does it mean when this time of crisis and challenging time, the RLOs and communities are stepping up? It is also a part of like the living example of this global compact of refugees, talking about the whole of society, everybody's stepping up, everybody's doing their little bit, not only heavily reliant on the one big guy or 2, 3 big guys, we're looking at, okay, we can also do something, let's do it together. So keeping the refugee protecting ecosystem alive, we need this. Without this, we cannot. So the genuine partnership is so important, and we need to build that again and again. And also there is one good example of the Jordanian refugee and the UNHCR and co-designing this, what is this called? Community-based protection, mobilizing the local communities and refugees together, making them own the modality, working towards the social cohesion and integration, because integration in this region is very sensitive. Nobody want to talk about it. And we don't want to integrate. What does it mean? And it's going to be a lot of pull factor. So I think in that sense, this partnership is so important. Also, working it through this dynamic. And the bigger question is it really important that INGO versus RLO, RLO versus INGO, and who do the job? Or is it really important in saving life and doing the practical measure? And then looking at the modality of just doing charity and humanitarian versus how do we move to development? How do we move to self-reliance of the refugee communities, self-resilience, building the capacity, and then preparing the communities ready and prepared for the sustainable repatriation and resettlement, etc. But I'll shut it up here.
Thank you, Hafsar. I think we've covered the value of collaboration. I think we've covered some of the opportunities for collaboration. But it also requires leadership. And so I want to move our discussion now to the different spaces where we may turn to for that leadership. And James, I may start with you. And I think, we heard earlier in today about the leadership role that the state government has played here, and how it tends to take often step up more than the federal government does in this space. And so I guess I'm keen to get your take on what the reasons for that are, but also how we can sort of scale up or learn from this experience to influence both the national and international agenda.
Yeah. Well, the whys are hard. There's an easy way to answer it, but also it's hard. And to be honest, we shouldn't ask the question as if that's going to be the reality always as well. Because of course we've seen federal governments do wonderful things in leadership, and we all live in hope. And no, it's not that. No, and no, we all just want a more active role of all spheres of government, and that's just the fact. So I don't want to take the presumption that that it should always be led by states or local government. Though I really take the point I've made that it should be led locally, and there should certainly be that. And that's one of the reasons I guess state government can take a bit more of a leadership role is partly because it's more local. So I think Kate was talking about it as well, about the face-to-face contact people have with politicians. Your MPs in the state government will be closer to the community. They won't be spending time in Canberra. You can harass them, you can engage them, and they'll be considering people living locally as well. And likewise, services here will be based locally, and they will be more directly linked to their leadership and decision makers. It won't be someone who speaks to someone who speaks to assistant secretary somewhere else and someone in Canberra. It will be someone more closely linked to that. So there is probably that idea of access to government, and also government's access to community as well. It's probably also safe to say that different jurisdictions actually have different legal responsibilities. And the state government, in some ways, we don't have the same responsibilities and we don't have the same access to funds. But sometimes that's a positive thing as well. We are not responsible for policing how people enter the country and how admission is done. We are not dragged into debates about the border. The tone of some of those things can be directed in different ways and can be directed more locally, as how are people living here and are we doing right by them? And I think it's probably fair to say that that allows a certain level of leadership to be taken as well. And perhaps we're more connected to the stakeholders, like the stakeholders who are here in this room. And perhaps that allows us to listen to them more carefully. It makes it harder for state government to avoid them. It makes it more real for us as well. And there's people who live in their communities, the decision makers are. I think all of those things are probably true, and probably what that is. It's probably a very simple thing. And we're not concerned with other things about people's visa classes and others as well. And look, and also, sometimes I guess the tensions between federal and state government, they create political opportunities as well. And there is some space in that to maneuver, some space to influence, but also a space to show yourself as being apart from that as well. And I guess if we talk about sort of scaling some of those things up, I guess we might talk about the fact that for us as a state, having a smaller scale allows us to do things that the federal government might not be able to do. We might be able to engage with people more. We might be able to have a bit more, I guess, political movement, or administratively some things might be easier, like the settlement strategy and the work being done with the JPWG and all the networks that are here. It's a smaller amount of stakeholders. We can understand the outcomes a little better. And it also means they can hold us more accountable. The governance can have those people impacted in it, more readily involved. And we might have the political space to allow that to happen, and sort of, I guess, the proximity to allow those elements of being held accountable and governance to take place as well. And I know we talked about some of those funding that you were talking about earlier, the international funding has to do a certain way. Perhaps in state government, we are also able to test things as well. And we saw some of those things during COVID, where it's not just the New South Wales state government, but certainly the Victorians and others were able to provide money for asylum seekers and services provided to them, even when the federal government might have absconded from that responsibility at that time. And perhaps we can do that because of the scale and our ability to make decisions and our ability to create our own, grants, policies, and the ways of doing things. And I guess with that, with the ability to do that, what we are doing is setting precedents. And I know we're talking about precedents that can be international, but even within jurisdictions, some of those precedents can be set. And sometimes it's just about creating an evidence base, being able to say, this works, it only costs this much, the outcome is this so-so, and we can do that, we can advocate, we can create those, that academic sort of literature behind it, we can create those bases, and we might be able to remove the political risk of things. If something happens in New South Wales, perhaps then someone in the Northern Territory can say, well, if New South Wales did it, we can also do it. And that's an important way in which we function as a federation as well, Sometimes it does take someone to step outside the line to help everyone else move along as well. And I think all that stuff is sort of just the real politic of it. And I guess, that's part of the things that we want as well from the state as well. We want to set things up in such a way that others can replicate it, that others can take it on board, and we can, I guess, pave the way. And I guess the flip side of that is also we create pressure on people as well. So when different states do different things, I know Victoria have done some things in advance of us, we've done other things, and other states have done things. And when they create those models or create those funding platforms, it does pressure other states to have to be held accountable to their constituents. And that's a really important part of the dynamic we have as a federation as well.
Yeah.
And hopefully that some of that rubs off, both federally and internationally as well.
But I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. It seems to be the opposite of what we see internationally, where there's the same dynamics, but the pressure seems to be pushing a race to the bottom rather than increasing protection. And I can't. Yeah, I mean, do you have any insights to why that might be? Why it pays out differently?
But even internationally, it's not true that's always been the case.
Yeah.
The US was once the leader in providing refugee protection, and created many of the systems and funded many of the international instruments that were used, and that is a level of political will that's involved there. But I don't want to talk about that too much. But I do believe it is down to the local and how engaged people are politically in understanding the issues and how well our systems of democracy are as well. But yeah.
Now, that's an excellent segue, James, to the local. And I'll turn back over to you, Hafsar. I feel like we've been leaning on refugee-led organisations a lot throughout all the sessions in terms of dealing with all the issues that the current system is facing. But I'm keen to hear your views of what role you see grassroots organisations, refugee-led organisations playing in showing more leadership in terms of building the collaborations that we need to see.
Yes, I like the way how one of my mentors described all these refugees and affected communities. She called it people who are at the center of the struggle. So whoever you are working with, people who are at the center of the struggle, without them, what are you even doing? That's the first thing. And the center of the struggle are us, right? So, well, forgive me if I'm talking a lot about the UN General Assembly. I just came back and my head is still there. And I was even thinking about, how that assembly can be designed if people involved. And it is not so practical because people were not so involved in the designing and preparing all of that. And the outcome is like, where are we? So also, I like your point about evidence-based because if I may now take out my co-SG head of apron and wearing my refugee hat, I am sick and tired of hearing that refugees are the burden and we are sharing the burden. And there are many reports that have been conducted and produced by many researchers and institutions that prove that actually refugees and migrants contribute to the host community a lot. But then what they do, all these governments in the region are constantly pushing back to implement any policy that would improve a little bit of dignified living status for refugees. With this pushback is that we have our own problem in our own country. Why would we bear this burden? When I was a refugee in Malaysia for 9 years before this 2019, before I got resettled to New Zealand 6 years ago, I can tell you, I did not get anything from the Malaysia government, and they might be watching me. They might ban my entry to Malaysia again. I did not take anything from them, nothing free. I work, whether legal or illegal, the money that I earn, I spend it there. It's the same for every refugees. And I can tell you all this big, tall building in government sector that has been built by the sweat and blood of refugees with the underpaid money. And this is contributing a lot to that. And then I love that evidence of, actually, Why? Why are you resisting? That's why the refugee leadership, people who are at the center of the struggle, and their participation is so important to look at this, what is this called, the ecosystem protection. The protection ecosystem is involve all of us. And it requires all of us to work as a collective, and I'm so obsessed with this collective leadership and collective movement building towards this refugee response at this critical time. How do we do this movement without these people who are at the center of the struggle? So, and I'm also sick and tired because we had this one reflection meeting after the UN high-level conference on the situation of Rohingya and other minorities of Myanmar. And then there was a reflection with the people who attended and spoke, and then other NGOs who work for the Rohingya refugee response. And then I said, you know what? We did not get anything closer after the assembly. That's my reflection. Everybody's calling it as a success. I said, it's very premature to call it as a success. What do you mean by success? Just because you bring all the member states and 2 minutes each and deliver, and then they run away, and then nobody talk about who is going to take the lead on ceasefire, who is going to take the lead on ensuring there is a restoring land rights, and then the property rights, and restoring the identity rights for these people. You just come and say, oh, we really condemn and sorry, and that. So the point is, if that has been design, co-design, and work with us, there might have been something else. We might go to the General Assembly, look, because we are bringing all these important people in the room, we are already going with a prepared roadmap proposing this. Because the situation of return for these people is not going to happen now, we are looking ahead 3 years of roadmap that require A, B, C, D. We are asking all the member states here, are you going to be involved in this, in this, in this? Are you pledging? In that way, they will have been so fruitful. And then going back to the reflection session, and that one NGO was so upset when I said, Rohingyas are not going back in 6 months' time. So what do you want? Do you want us to host you 20 years in our country? We are a very poor country. How about other rich country in different part of the world? Nobody's hosting you. I said, sir, we don't want to live in your country in the refugee camp with a very dire situation for another 20 years. We don't want to. But I want you to know respectfully, the practicality is that they are not going anywhere in the next 6 months. Therefore, we must talk about how do we think about innovative ideas that begin with us and you. So without that, nothing is going to make sense, long story short. And then they constantly love to talk about bearing the burden of this hosting 1.3 million refugees in the country. I can remember since 2017, many member states and countries have said 150 million to Bangladesh government and 60 million. All of that might have been closer to billion now. And then the other day thinking, if this billion of money in the operationalization of it, implementation of it, if we were involved, we will know exactly what we need, what we are looking at. We will not do the charity for 7 years. People are begging for it. It is very dehumanizing. You have to beg for your food and survival. Everyone want to work and have a dignified human life. So if we were designing it, we would have a roadmap like, okay, now this is the temporary and urgency. We're looking at development from charity, and then resilience, and then capacity building, and radiant preparedness for the resettlement and integration. With that billion, we might have gone somewhere. And we are nowhere closer because why? There was no leadership and of partnership of the people who are at the center of the struggle. I'll stop it here.
Thank you, Hafsar. Jeff, if I can throw back over to you now. And we have a new UNHCR High Commissioner starting in early 2026. And if you had their ear, Jeff, what would your top 3 suggestions be for how they can demonstrate and reassert their leadership in the protection space and preserve the protection mandate of UNHCR going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, as you've just mentioned, the current High Commissioner will be stepping down at the end of the year. The search is currently on for a new High Commissioner. At least 8 or 9 different candidates have been proposed by states, which is a much larger number than has been the case in the past. I very much doubt if I'll have the opportunity to speak to any of them, but if I did, there's a number of things that I would probably want to say to them. Firstly, I'd want to ask them, do you really want this job, and why do you want this job? Because I would argue that the High Commissioner's position is a difficult job at the best of times, and it's arguably an impossible one at the moment. So I would really want to ask, why do you want the job? And do you really want it? And are you aware of the challenges that it entails? My second point would be to point out that the High Commissioner's job involves at least 4 different activities. Firstly, the High Commissioner has to be a manager of a very large and sprawling organisation. Secondly, he or she has to be an international diplomat, constantly on the move to keep in touch with a whole range of different stakeholders. Thirdly, the High Commissioner has to be a fundraiser. As you know, UNHCR has basically none of its own money. It has to raise all of its funds for its operations and its programs. And fourthly, and most evidently, it has to be an advocate for refugee protection principles. And my advice to a new High Commissioner would be to say, you've really got to find an adequate balance between these four different functions and also manage the tensions between them. Something I've seen in the past, for example, is that a High Commissioner who focuses too much on being an international diplomat ignores the day-to-day management of the organisation, and a High Commissioner who's really focusing on fundraising may be tempted to play down what he or she says in terms of advocacy on behalf of protection principles. So balancing those different functions and managing the tensions between them, I think, are very important. I think something else I want to say to a new High Commissioner is try to learn some lessons from past experience and from the experience of your predecessors. If I could get a little bit personal on this, running through some of the previous High Commissioners, we had two, Jean-Pierre Hoquet and Ruud Lubbers, both had to resign under a cloud as a result of their personal behaviour. So a clear lesson to be learned there is you need to maintain the absolutely highest level of personal behaviour and your dealings with your staff members. Secondly, we had another High Commissioner, Thorvald Stoltenberg of Norway, who only stuck in the job for about 9 months and then announced that he'd been recalled to office by his government. And that was a great shock to the organisation. Clearly, we want somebody who's prepared to stick it out and not be at the disposal of their government, but at the disposal of the organisation as a whole. At the other extreme, we had another High Commissioner, Sadako Agata, who did a number of excellent things, but at the same time probably stayed in office too long. She wrote a book called The Turbulent Decade, which documented her experience as the High Commissioner for Refugees. And I think many of us would suggest that by the end of that turbulent decade, she was rather exhausted and jaded and perhaps should have relinquished the post earlier. And then going on to a more recent High Commissioner, Antonio Guterres, I think he got a lot of things right, and I enjoyed working with him immensely. At the same time, he became a little bit too preoccupied with interagency competition, particularly with IOM and with OCHA, and perhaps towards the end of his term in office, became a little bit too interested in what his next job would be, namely becoming Secretary General, and perhaps lost focus on the work of UNHCR. So I think some important lessons to be learned from the experience of past High Commissioners. Bringing to the present, I think the one real key challenge facing the new High Commissioner, and I really don't know how he or she is going to deal with this, is relationships with the USA and with the Trump administration. While the Trump administration has cut its funding to UNHCR, it nevertheless remains the organization's largest donor. We know that Trump is no friend of refugees or a friend of the United Nations. We know that he and his administration are ready to withdraw from organizations that contradict the administration's agenda. We've seen this with UNRWA, we've seen it with the World Health Organization. There is clearly a threat there to UNHCR. And under these conditions, there's going to be a real temptation to compromise with the USA. We've seen this particularly with IOM recently, and its preparedness to become involved in Trump's program of so-called self-deportation. And I would say that's not an example to be followed. So it's going to be a real challenge for the High Commissioner to manage the relationship with the USA, to stick to forceful public advocacy and refugee protection principles, as I've said in my earlier intervention, but at the same time being careful not to completely alienate the Trump administration. Exactly how they will manage that situation remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It sounds like a very tricky balancing act ahead for the incoming High Commissioner. One group that we haven't really talked about that much yet are lawyers. I know we tend to get a bad rap, but I think that there is I'd like you to reflect on the role that lawyers can play in this broader ecosystem, particularly the role that strategic litigation can play in advancing the rights of refugees in both Australia and globally, but also connecting with the themes of the panel today about how collaborative is that work in practice and how do we make it more collaborative. And we're getting to the end of our time, so if I could ask you to just keep it to about 3 minutes if you can.
Oh, gosh.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so we're going to see an increase in strategic refugee rights litigation in Australia globally, partly just because of increasing state hostility towards refugees, but also because in Australia in particular, there has been some economic changes which have really enhanced the ability of different aspects of the legal centre to do strategic litigation. So different approaches to philanthropy, which has mean community legal centres have been able to grow and invest in a diversity of skill sets, not just lawyers, but, for example, marketing and communications. There's been, I'm not going to bore you with the details, changes to rules around recovery of costs in pro bono matters, which have been really essential for the establishment and sustainability of small boutique strategic litigation organisations, often solely focused on refugee rights. Much more growing relationships between the community legal centres and top tier and mid-tier commercial firms, and those commercial firms doing a lot of the actual pro bono work in litigation, addressing refugee policies. And then you've also got the traditional plaintiff firms, and what's changed, I think, over the last decade or two is dedicated pro bono teams and those teams having really strong relationships with refugee advocacy organisations. These different aspects of the legal sector are already highly collaborative. And what's really interesting is there's a real commitment to relational thinking. So there's a real understanding of the ecosystem and where their institution fits within the ecosystem. Part of the ecosystem I think that might be missing, and I think where scholars could have a real impact, is measuring the impact of strategic litigation, especially beyond the courtroom, because that's work that needs to be done, rigorously, methodically, and that can't always be funded by strategic litigation organisations, and perhaps more appropriately needs to be done at that arm's distance level. Transnationally, I think it's really interesting. There has been a growth over the last decade of transnational strategic litigation organisations who have ironically been inspired by some of your work, Daniel, on the way in which non-entree policies, for example, exclusion policies have travelled around the world. So for example, ministers of immigration meeting with their UK counterparts, strategic litigators have gone, well, if they're sharing knowledge, why don't we share knowledge as well? Why don't we get together? And these networks are mobilising, and what I see again attending these events is that diversity of actors. Lawyers from the big international top-tier commercial firms to, again, plaintiff firms to community legal centres and et cetera. So that diversity, I think, lends growth and sustainability. I'm sorry, we've got time for questions, so you can. Okay.
I didn't want to rush you. You can finish
One more comment?
Please.
Just to pick up on some of the conversations today about listening and active listening, and yes, we can do that personally, but we can also do that institutionally through deliberative democracy initiatives. So citizens' assemblies, mini publics, okay, we need to talk. I have just finished research with Ron Levy and Henry Palmley on the use of citizen assemblies in highly polarised human rights issues, example, abortion, trans rights, freedom of speech. They can be highly successful. It is happening in the refugee space in Europe. I think we've seen one good semi-example here, but I think this is a really interesting potential connection between strategic litigation. How do we use that evidence that's collected as part of strategic litigation, disseminate it more broadly to the middle, and we can do that through deliberative democracy. So it is a way of institutional active listening. So that's the last point I'll finish off on. I think that's a really important initiative.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm sorry for rushing you.
That's okay.
I would turn to some questions now, and I might come back. I have lots of more questions of my own, but I might come back for some wrap-up questions at the end. But before I get to that, I'll open some questions from firstly from Slido, and I've got one here. Like Jane, I apologise. I'm not looking at my phone because I'm reading the news. I'm getting my text messages with the Slido questions. And there's one kind of synthesizing a few of them. It's how can state governments work with the federal government on overlapping issues such as work rights for asylum seekers, which is currently federal, or poverty and homelessness, which is currently state.
You can go, Kate, you can go.
Poverty and homelessness, state. So one thing I would say is one of the greatest challenges to scaling community sponsorship is the availability of housing. So we've talked about sort of the global financial crises, the defunding of USAID, for example. We haven't talked about national economic crises. So I think in particular in the UK and Ireland, what we've seen is so many sponsorship groups starting up, but they cannot sponsor because they cannot find housing. Yeah. But interestingly about partnerships and the way housing has been opened up, so faith partnerships, but someone asked a question earlier about business and the role of business. Private landlords, interestingly, have been an interesting player in community sponsorship, so they're able to, they own hundreds, probably thousands of properties across the UK, are willing to provide them on a ex gratia basis to community sponsors, which is interesting. So that's just one example of some practical ways we can address that.
Very quick. Well, planning for this is really important. And I think we know where new refugee cohorts are coming from. We know where conflicts are happening. We can predict some of these things that are taking place and where our intake might come from, and also where we want to settle people. And it's really important for state and federal government to work together to think what infrastructure needs to be there first. Are we just sending people to Armidale but not looking at how many GPs are there? Or do we need to figure out what needs to be there to make their settlement successful? And some of that involves planning and investment. And that's one of the things that we're finding there's a bit of a struggle to get at the moment, to get that kind of consistency and getting the data and the planning from the federal government that's looking out a few years' time, and then coming up together as partners to match what the investment is in that local community, and also to prepare people locally for that as well.
Thank you, James.
Really quick, yeah.
We're going to open up for questions to the floor now.
Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me here? Okay, thank you very much for this very productive discussion. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Sujin Ree. I'm the newly appointed UNHCR representative, so I just assumed my role here in July of this year. And it was very inspiring to hear all the comments and also the lively discussion here. And also from the beginning of the first stage, there was a lot of elaboration of UNHCR. And I take note of all the comments that have been mentioned. And also we do understand some of the challenges and concerns raised by all the participants. But I also want to acknowledge the strong civil society and the refugee-led organizations, academia, who's really working tirelessly in Australia to make sure the refugee rights are respected in the current environment where there's a erosion of human rights, and also the refugee law and many of the convention issues that is being challenged. And also their member state who wants to rewrite the refugee convention that is more palatable to the member state. So this is the context that UNHCR is working and all of us are facing in this crisis. And this is why I just wanted to mention that this is a whole of society approach, that everyone has a part to work together to make sure that our voices are heard. And it has to be all of you being involved here because you're the citizens of Australia, and you can make the politician hear your voice and make them accountable and walk the talk of what they have committed. Especially, they have made 23 Global Refugee Forum pledges. And there's going to be a progress review high-level meeting in December from 15 to 17, where they're going to be coming and sharing what they have committed and where do they stand here. And a few examples, the government has made commitment 2 years ago is they're going to increase the resettlement places from 20 to 27,000, additional 10,000 complementary pathway, and also looking at the asylum system. So this is some of the things that we need to make sure that the politicians and the government. Oh, I hope it's not the sabotage here. Yeah. But just to make sure that the government and the politician really abide by their commitment to respect the obligation that they have promised. But then also, I just want to highlight the positive element that the Australian government has made. We're going to be reaching a milestone of 1 million refugees that have been resettled to Australia since 1947. So if you do a math, the calculation, I know some may have deceased, but they're offspring. So can you imagine the percentage of people who benefited from the refugee and contributing to the society in Australia? As mentioned, the refugees are not a burden, but they are a contributor of the society. And this is evidenced by many of the research papers, especially like the Ukraine refugee in Poland who contributed to the 2024 GDP 2.7%. So I just wanted to highlight that this is a very monumental way that we will need to work together, that this is a partnership. And your strong advocacy is really needed in a very challenging context here. And UNHCR is also experiencing issues with all the revision of mandates and the financial cut here. We do understand their proliferation of mandate, 3,400 mandate. UNHCR has a mandate to protect, find solution for refugee and asylum seekers. And we have a mandate to prevent and reduce statelessness. Please bear in mind, if these are the mandate given by the member state, if they get rid of those mandates, there's no state who are going to be advocating for the refugees and the stateless people. So we need to make sure those mandates and principles are respected, that we are here to serve the people who need the most from us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that very powerful call to action. I just might throw 2 more questions from Slido to the panel for just quick responses, and then I'll take maybe 1 more question from the floor. There's one about young people. We haven't talked about young people much. How do we mobilize young people to have more of a voice and play a bigger role in this space? And then also, how do we promote the work that's being done at a local level? It gets lost in the mass political narrative. So how do we change that, and how do we get the good stories out there?
Does anyone?
Yeah, I can go first. So we have, APRAN has a youth working group. So that youth working group is mainly focusing on bringing youth from displaced background. So we did in 2023 Youth Summit, bringing youth from Asia and Pacific region together, inspiring their vision and etc. So forth. That is ongoing effort because, in our region there was like elder versus younger. You listen to me and I don't listen. So it's an ongoing things, but we are trying to do that, giving the youth the leadership and visibility. So there's some good practices there. After the panel, please be in touch. I'll share some of those links with you. And I think the role of youth is so important. I was also having a chat with my mentor there, and unfortunately, from our observation, this forced displacement and refugee crisis is not going to end in the next 5 years. We need younger generation of group of leaders coming along with the knowledge and institutional support and tools equipped to carry on this work, because we cannot sustain this without bringing in the youth leaders and fresh perspective. We, the middle-aged and older people, we're only thinking want to stick into it. So the younger people has fresh perspective and new ideology, and that can be mentored and tailored and guided by the people who have been here in the sector long term. This is imperative that we have these younger voices, and also giving the visibility of local level localization. It is the responsibility of all of us who have the platform to be in those international regional places, constantly highlighting their work and their impact. As I said, the similar impact that can be delivered with 500 or 700K can be delivered by a local refugee-led, women-led organization with 100K, and the impact is the same. So we have to constantly educate, learn and unlearn these things whenever and wherever there is opportunity presents. It's become an ongoing work. Over.
Thank you. Do anyone else have a quick response?
I just wanted to add what you said about the importance of bringing new generations through. And I think that really connects to the panel that we just had about meaningful participation and making sure that participation of refugees is adequately resourced, appropriately resourced financially and with the appropriate sources. Just one example, if I may, please. Daniel, about, so I'm sort of involved in projects about refugee-led research. How do we do refugee-led research and how do we make sure that it is funded, etc. So as part of my Australian Research Council grant on strategic litigation, I was like, how do I do this? I'm not from a refugee background. So I embedded within the project, or in the grant application, a PhD specifically for a person with a refugee background. And I was really nervous about how the Australian Research Council would react to this because it was a really weird thing to do. I got a great response, and I think there might be some parallels to learn there when people are thinking about applications for philanthropic funding as well. So that's just a really practical example of ensuring that we have got younger generations coming through who are getting that support and who are getting the adequate resources, but also too that they have the appropriate intellectual freedom, that it's not transactional. It's not like I'm doing this project of work and you're just going to do this little bit for me and I'm going to tell you how it's going to work. I specifically, this PhD project is not integrated with my project specifically. It's alongside, so the research can be entirely independent and she can come up with completely different ideas and we can actually even disagree with each other. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take one more question from the floor. Emily?
Thanks so much for the really great panel. I'm Emily McDonnell from the Australian Human Rights Commission. My question, I think we've heard a lot of really positive and innovative ideas in relation to the whole of society approach. And Jeff touched a little bit on it in his presentation, but I wanted to understand a little bit more from the panel about how you see a whole of society approach responding to like really entrenched international refugee protection trends like the externalisation of migration control, offshore processing, boat pushbacks. How can a whole of society approach actually go some way in trying to tackle those really entrenched policies? Thanks.
Thanks, Emily.
I think that's an example of that would be strategic litigation, the Medivac litigation. Strategic litigation is not a silver bullet. And the first people who will say that are strategic litigators. Probably the best you can get is half victories. What was the half victory there now that the dust has settled? I think there's acknowledgement now on behalf of our political leaders and I think on the behalf of the broader community. We do not send children to offshore processing. That was the victory that was achieved. So that's an example of, I don't know if I would say a whole of society approach. Certainly, multi-sector collaboration on the Medivac, litigation and associated legislative reform. But then again, I think you can work towards whole of society because it gets that question of how do we disseminate the evidence to the middle? Because I did a project on the quote-unquote stranded Australians during COVID, and what was really interesting about that was the number of them who really didn't know about offshore processing, like knew about it vaguely, and then it was their own issues with border crossings that brought them about. And once they read about it, once they really knew what was happening, they went from either agnostic, disengaged, to being very anti-offshore processing, or even going from agreeing with offshore processing to completely disagreeing with it and mobilising against it.
Can I quickly add on that? So I think one of the barriers that we feel as the human rights defender and community advocate is that not knowing what is happening there at the top level. If I can speak here confidentially, I often struggle why both the government of Australia and New Zealand will invest a lot of money from stopping people to come in. I never make sense. I don't understand why are you spending this many millions of money for Bali process and stopping asylum seekers and all that. Please enlighten me. I just don't understand. Versus this promoting the actual asylum seeking system in the country. And it's just, if you don't tell us what is holding you back, we don't know where to come in and support you so you don't feel alone as the government and state level. And please count us in. I mean, we are the refugee leaders. We are human rights defenders. We are civil society. We don't hold the same equal power as you, but I do strongly believe that there is something that we can play along with you. We can be your teammate and, and you don't have to be so lonely and then, we can't implement this because, and this and this and this and that. And without talking to, we don't know where to come in and how to help you. And that is the reason why a whole of society approach cannot happen. Sometimes the high-level meeting happen. Do you know what is happening? I don't know. Who is being invited? I don't know. What is the agenda? I don't know. And I don't know how to help. So that is becoming the main barriers for us to implement this whole of society approach. And you are intentionally, institutionally excluding particular group, and you're being alone at your own, and the government don't talk with each other. And then there were some good practices in Thailand. All of you might have seen that there was a walk ride that is a good example of this collective movement and this coordination of impact. And then I have not heard that Thailand has gone to the, facing the wall of the end situation because they have randomly allowed refugees to walk. This kind of things can be inspired by and led by two other countries. And to make it happen, we need this transparency and accountability and opening the space for us to come in and join hand with you to make this a whole of society approach happen.
Just before we wrap up, I just want to provide an opportunity again to the panel, basically to pull some of the discussions together in terms of how we can implement some of this, the things we've been discussing in practice, but also an invitation to share in particular any specific examples of good practice that we can build on, if there's ones that you haven't already touched on already. And I might throw over to you, Jeff, first. And I'm sorry, I'm just also saying we're going to have to keep it about 30 seconds each because we're running out of time.
I'm not a great fan of the notion of whole of society approach, but I totally take on board the need to engage with a wide range of different stakeholders. For the past couple of years, I've been working more in the advocacy area than in the research or policy areas. One of my conclusions is that we spend far too much time talking to each other and talking to people who agree with us rather than reaching out to people with different views. So here in the UK, for example, I spend a lot of time talking to other advocates, other people are essentially in favour of refugee protection. We don't do that much work in terms of reaching out to trade unions, faith-based organisations, the private sector, and politicians who basically disagree with us. So I would say it's nice to work with people that agree with us, but we really need to reach out to those who disagree with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. There's a lot of shaking heads in the room if you can't see them. Any other final thoughts?
Oh, look.
So, no, you go ahead.
No, look, I don't want to mention too much about the political stuff. I do believe that institutions change, and we say things are entrenched, but we've always felt that way. South Africa used to be in apartheid. We had a very different view of refugees before what happened in Vietnam into China, and all those things changed. Institutions changed with them. And a lot of it was because of a whole society approach, because different actors joined together, people who wouldn't otherwise find a common cause did so. And I think there is a reality that takes place. Even if you see things happening in other countries in the US, it's because people have come together, perhaps not for the reasons we'd want them to, but they've come together for particular outcomes. But look, and I appreciate what everyone said, what Jeff was saying. I think we have to talk to people who are going to be slightly different as well. I know with some of the work that we do, we've had to bring in actuaries and others to say, this is, if we spend this much money to do this good, this is the economic benefit. It's like an ugly way of putting things, and we're talking about people's lives and human rights, but sometimes that's what you need to do to talk to Treasury, to explain ROI, and there is that sort of balance between the pragmatic and the principled with that as well.
Thanks, James. I think we might have to leave it there.
Okay.
But please join me in thanking the panel again for sharing those great insights.